My name is Margaret Cole, 72 years old, living alone on the outskirts of Maple Ridge, Oregon. The little house at the end of Cedar Lane has never changed. The old shingle roof, the backyard full of lavender, and the familiar quiet of a neighborhood filled mostly with older folks. For years, everything had been calm, ordinary, and at times a little lonely. Yet today, after our first family gathering since before the pandemic, I felt a rare lightness in my chest. My daughter, Laura, brought her husband and my little granddaughter to visit. We had lunch, reminisced, and occasionally burst into laughter over old photos from Laura's high school years. I thought, maybe, just maybe, my family had finally found its way back to some of the warmth we once had. I had no idea that only a few hours later, my entire life would turn in a completely different direction. I was sitting at the corner of the kitchen table, my mug of mint tea still steaming. While Laura was picking up her daughter's toys in the living room, I opened my banking app to check my savings, a weekly habit of mine. 35 years of putting aside whatever I could. Not much, but enough to take care of myself without bothering anyone. The screen loaded. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. Balance, 1429s. I hit refresh, then again, and again. The number didn't change. A cold wave ran from my arms down into my stomach. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped my phone. The mint aroma of the tea in front of me vanished, replaced by a metallic taste in my mouth. I could no longer hear Laura chatting with the little one in the living room. It was as if all sound had been sucked out of the house. I opened the transaction history. Large withdrawals, one after another, for weeks. None of them was mine. I heard footsteps behind me. Brandon, Laura's husband, stood there with a beer can in hand, leaning casually against the doorway. 38 years old, tall, with a face that always looked like he was preoccupied with himself. I had tried to be cordial over the years, though I'd always sensed something a little careless in the way he viewed everything. I hadn't even asked anything yet when Brandon spoke. No hesitation, no shame. Just one sentence, light as a whisper, but heavier than anything I'd ever heard. We needed it more than you, Maggie. I froze. That sentence pinned me in place. No yelling, no excuses, just a level of nonchalance so cold it felt cruel. Laura stepped out of the living room, her smile fading. She looked at me, then at Brandon, but said nothing. No explanation, no defense. Something inside me sank deeply. And let me be clear, that was the moment I understood this wasn't a mistake, not even a little. Before I go on with what happened next, and I promise you, it gets far more unbelievable, allow me to say this one thing. My voice is soft but sincere. If you believe older people deserve respect, or if you've ever seen someone mistreated in their own family, hit subscribe so you can follow along. This story is long, true, and filled with turns that even I couldn't believe as they happened. Now, let's go back to that moment. The moment I realized my account was empty, and the person who took everything was standing right inside my home. Laura stood a few steps away from me, still holding her daughter's box of Legos. Her smile vanished when she saw how pale I'd become. She glanced at the phone screen, then at Brandon. She didn't ask, didn't speak, just stood there as if trying to piece together something she already suspected. I know my daughter. Whenever she's anxious, she bites her lower lip. Now it was nearly white from how hard she'd been pressing it. Her other hand was clenched into a fist, but relaxed immediately when she noticed me watching. No words of support, no questions for my sake. Her discomfort needed no explanation. It was in her avoiding eyes, in her unsteady breathing, and in the way she tried to look busy when there was clearly nothing for her to do. I took a long breath, trying to steady my voice, though my mind was spinning. I reopened the app, and again, I told myself, maybe the system glitched. Maybe this was a different account. Maybe... No, there was no maybe. Every refresh showed the exact frozen numbers, cold and unmoving, staring back at me. I I set the phone on the table, but my hands were trembling so badly that it slipped from my palm and tapped against the wooden surface. The sound made my granddaughter look up from the living room. Then silence returned. The ticking of the wall clock, something I'd never paid attention to, grew sharp, metallic, almost intrusive. My house had always been quiet, but now the quiet felt wrong. As though everything around me was waiting for me to collapse or explode. I did neither. I just sat as straight as I could, forcing my breath to stay even while my chest tightened painfully. Why? I wanted to ask, but the words caught in my throat, heavy and stuck. Laura took one step closer and lowered her voice. Mom, maybe you tapped something by accident? Her question was gentle, but it felt like a weight dragging me downward. Not because she meant to insult me, but because she was clinging to any explanation that didn't involve Brandon. Brandon stood behind her, arms crossed, as though this had nothing to do with him anymore. He didn't even look at me, just stared at his beer can, as if checking how much was left. I grabbed my phone again, tried one more time, like maybe a miracle would happen if I simply kept trying. But nothing changed. It was the same list of withdrawals, each one a clean, precise cut. In that moment, I felt it clearly. The air inside the house had shifted. This was no longer the warm family gathering it had been earlier. It was the beginning of a crisis I had never imagined. And I knew, whether I liked it or not, I would have to confront it. I hadn't even managed to stand up when a knock sounded at the door, firm and clear. Not the kind of knock from a neighbor stopping by. I looked at Laura. She looked at me. Neither of us said a word. Another knock. Brandon frowned, set his beer can on the table a little more carefully than usual, then headed toward the front door. He opened it with his usual annoyed expression. 2 police officers stood there. The man introduced himself first. Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Officer Daniel Perez. Beside him was a woman with short hair, her eyes serious but kind. And I'm Officer Marlene Woods. Both were in full uniform, not tense, but definitely not here to ask for directions. Their presence made the already quiet house feel even more silent. Officer Perez looked directly at me, his voice low but warm. Mrs. Margaret Cole, correct? Your bank sent us a report about 20 minutes ago. They informed us that your account had multiple unusual transactions and signs of potential elder financial exploitation. I tightened my hands together. That phrase sounded both foreign and painfully honest. Officer Woods stepped forward, her tone gentler. This means someone has used your information to transfer money without your permission. By law, the bank must notify us immediately if they suspect any form of financial abuse. We'll need to take your statement and take a look at your phone, if you allow it. I nodded, unable to say anything. Laura stood behind me, rubbing her palms together over and over. She looked from me to the officers, clearly trying to understand everything faster than her mind could manage. Her eyes kept darting toward Brandon as if waiting for him to explain, but he refused to meet her gaze. Brandon's entire demeanor shifted. When Officer Perez mentioned unusual transactions, he inhaled sharply, his shoulders twitching. There must be some mistake, Brandon cut in. She's elderly. Sometimes she taps the wrong. Officer Woods interrupted, calm but firm. We reviewed the access logs, sir. This wasn't a mistake. Brandon stopped. His face changed instantly, no longer confident or casual. Instead, he looked unsettled, like someone caught before he'd had time to hide the evidence. Officer Perez turned back to me. Mrs. Margaret, we're here to support you. No one is blaming you. Right now, we're just going to sit down and start from the beginning. In that moment, I didn't just feel afraid. I felt something else. Like the truth had finally walked into the house, and it wasn't letting anyone hide anymore. After the 2 officers left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. Laura stood at the living room doorway, as if she wanted to say something, but then stepped back. Brandon had disappeared the moment the police stepped off the porch. The house felt like a cold draft had swept through, leaving everyone unsettled. I opened my contacts list. There was one name I had never deleted, though we hadn't spoken in years: Henry Dalton. Henry was around 55 now. I met him when he was a law student interning at a small legal office in town. Back then, I helped organize community events and once helped raise funds so he could keep running a free legal aid program he cared deeply about. Henry always said that without my help, he would have given up. This time, I needed him. I pressed call. His voice came through after 2 rings, deep, steady, with the added weight of someone who'd been in the legal field a long time. "Margaret, it's been a while. Are you all right?" I told him briefly. My account was wiped out, the police visit, the suspicion pointing towards someone in my family. Henry didn't interrupt. I only heard the faint tapping of his keyboard, as if he were taking notes. "Send me everything you have, statements, access logs, anything," Henry said. "I'll be there in 45 minutes. And he meant it. Not even an hour later, Henry was sitting in my kitchen, his leather briefcase on the table, his eyes fixed on the transaction history on my phone. He pulled up a chair and scanned each line. 8 weeks, Henry murmured. "They started withdrawing steadily 8 weeks ago." He zoomed in on the password change log. "Here, your password was changed twice." Then he opened the security settings. The authentication number was switched to a different phone. He looked up at me, his voice firm. "Margaret, this isn't petty theft. This is planned." I straightened my back. "Is there a way to get the money back?" "Yes," he answered immediately, "but it's going to be a fight, and I need to assemble an investigation team." Henry took out a sheet of paper and wrote down 3 names. He circled the first one, Rowan Lim. Rowan is a digital forensics specialist. He can trace login IPs, identify which device accessed your account and from where. If someone used their laptop or phone to take your money, Rowan will find it. The second name, Dr. Elaine Kurt. Elaine is a document expert. If there's any forged signature, altered paperwork, or manipulated information, she'll spot it immediately. Henry set the pen down. "I want both of them on this by next week." I looked at him. In that moment, the only thing keeping me steady was Henry's calmness. He didn't sugarcoat anything, didn't make vague promises. He faced the truth head on and handled it step by step, the way a true professional does. "Henry," I said slowly, "thank you for coming." He gave a small, genuine smile. "You helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn." And right then I understood. The fight to reclaim my justice had officially begun. Rowan Lim showed up the next morning, so punctual it felt like he'd been waiting outside since dawn. He looked about 30, wore glasses, had a compact build, and moved with the quick, efficient energy of someone whose mind was constantly processing 2 or 3 data streams at once. "I'll go through every access log from your banking account," Rowan said as he opened his laptop, explaining each step in simple terms. "I won't dive into the technical jargon. You just need to know the results." I sat across from him, my hands clasped. Henry stood beside me, watching closely. Rowan turned the screen toward us. An access chart appeared. "This is your home IP," Rowan pointed to a green line. "Consistent, regular from your phone and computer." He scrolled down. "And this," a red entry appeared, "is a device that isn't yours, a laptop, logged into your account 9 times over 8 weeks. I pressed my lips together, a chill creeping down my spine. Rowan continued, "I compared the geolocation, about 3.5 kilometers from your house, in the East Hill area." Henry looked at me. East Hill was exactly where Brandon and Laura were renting their house. I didn't say anything. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears. "And here's another thing." Rowan opened a new tab. "Your alert email was changed." "When?" Henry asked. Rowan zoomed in on the timestamp. "About 7 weeks ago, same day the first withdrawal occurred." He typed rapidly, then tilted the screen toward us. A strange email address appeared. No name, no clue, just a jumble of meaningless characters. "You don't use this email, right?" Rowan asked. Of course not, I answered. Rowan nodded slightly. If this were an outside hacker, they would have had to bypass 3 layers of the bank's security, plus guess your personal security questions. The odds are pretty much 0. He looked up, summing it all in one sharp, clear sentence. This person knows you extremely well. Very well. The kitchen went so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind us. That afternoon, Dr. Elaine Kurt arrived. She was around 60, with gray hair tied neatly back, carrying herself with the calm of someone who had examined thousands of forged documents. Elaine laid the papers across the table, a sample of my signature from my bank records, and a request for information change the bank had sent us. She switched on a small magnifying lamp and leaned close to the page. "Have you ever signed this document?" she asked. "I've never seen it." Elaine didn't look surprised. She tapped the surface of the paper lightly with her pencil. "Here." She pointed to the first curve of the M in the signature. "This stroke breaks where it should be continuous. You sign in one motion without lifting your pen, but the person who signed this lifted the pen 3 times. I leaned in. There were indeed tiny breaks, subtle enough that an untrained eye would miss them. "And this," Elaine continued, "the pressure. Heavy here, light here. A natural signature has consistent pressure. This is someone observing and trying to imitate." She shifted to the bottom corner of the document. "The date is written in a different ink. Someone added it afterward to make it look legitimate." I folded my arms across my chest, the tightness spreading to the center of my ribs. Henry asked quietly, "Can this be used as evidence?" Elaine replied instantly, "I can prepare a full forensic report. This is a forged signature." While everyone took notes, I leaned back in my chair. A few sudden memories surfaced, shards out of order like broken glass. At the family gathering the day before, I remembered Brandon standing at the kitchen counter asking casually, "Mom, how much have you saved for retirement? Must be plenty, right?" I had laughed it off. But now that I thought about it, his smile had been strange, held a second too long. Then another time, I distinctly remembered him nudging Laura and asking, "Do you know who your mom listed as the beneficiary? You know, just in case something unexpected happens." Back then, I thought he was being cautious. Now I understood. That wasn't concern. It was probing. Another memory. During the party, I stepped into my room to grab napkins. Brandon was there, rummaging through my desk drawer. He closed it quickly and said, "Oh, just looking for a pen for the kid." I believed him. Now I saw how naive that had been. I jolted slightly when Rowan spoke. "Mrs. Margaret, are you all right?" I nodded, steadying my voice. Henry sat down beside me, his tone low but certain. "What we found today is the foundation of the case. And Margaret, I'll be blunt. Every trace is pointing in the same direction." I didn't ask which direction. I knew. The pain was no longer a shock. It had taken on a different form, a slow-burning resolve. A sense that even if this knocked me down, I had to stand back up, not just to reclaim my money, but to reclaim myself. The investigation had only just begun, but the evidence was starting to come together, and the truth, no matter how painful, would have to be spoken. News of my loss spread more quickly than I had expected, not because anyone was gossiping, but because Maple Ridge was small, and people still paid attention to one another in a way that felt human. Not overly curious, not intrusive, just quiet concern among folks who had lived side by side for decades. That afternoon, I was sitting on my porch when Mrs. Lane from the house to my left walked over. She was about 78, petite but spry, usually wearing bright hand-knit sweaters. She carried a box of cookies, set it on the table in front of me, and spoke immediately, without circling around. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. I saw Brandon enter your house 3 times in the last 2 weeks. Always when you weren't home." I looked up. "Are you certain?" "I saw it clearly, every Wednesday and Friday. I even thought you asked him to check on the place." Mrs. Lane exhaled heavily. "I wish I had asked you sooner." I gently squeezed her hand, thanking her. No blame. She couldn't have known what it meant. Not 10 minutes later, Mr. Hopkins from the house on the right came over. He was in his early 60s, a former school bus driver, calm and thoughtful. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady and sincere, "I heard what happened. I need to tell you something. A few times I saw Brandon's green pickup parked in front of your house while you were volunteering at the community center. I assumed they were helping tidy up for you." He paused, looking regretful. "Now that I think about it, the pawnshop on Reed Avenue is right along the route from your place to theirs. Last Friday, I saw him driving from that direction. You should tell your lawyer." The only words I could manage were, "Thank you." All my life, I believed that most people were too busy with their own problems to notice anything else. But today, as one person after another stood at my door, bringing information, concern, and simple acts of kindness, I realized something. Even here in America, where independence is highly valued, good people are always around us. They don't need to shout. They don't need to be heroes. They just choose to stand on the right side when they see something wrong. Henry stood at a distance, watching, and gave me a slight nod. "For a case to move forward," he said, "evidence isn't enough. You need the truth spoken by the people who live around you." That afternoon, the breeze from Maple Ridge swept gently across my porch. I sat surrounded by neighbors I once thought were just people who nodded at me over the fence. Turns out, when hardship arrives, they step forward, lay a hand on your shoulder, and say, "You're not alone, Margaret." To me, that was a strength greater than anything, both for the legal battle ahead and for the journey to reclaim my own peace. That evening, my phone rang. The caller ID, Laura. I hesitated for a few seconds before answering. On the other end, her voice broke from the first word. "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know what to do." She sobbed in jerks, as if trying to speak between ragged breaths. Before I could reply, there was a loud noise as if someone had snatched the phone from her hand. Brandon's voice came through, rude and hurried, as if he'd lost control. "Margaret, cut it out. You're making a scene." I gripped the phone tightly. Brandon went on, louder now, full of irritation. "She's old. She wasn't even going to use that money." I sat motionless, each word clear, cold, and without remorse. He spoke of my age as if it justified taking the lifetime of savings I'd put away. He said I wouldn't use it, like old age somehow reduces a person's right to keep their own money. I couldn't hear Laura anymore. I only heard Brandon breathing hard, then a heavy thump, probably him ending the call by throwing the phone down onto a table. The call ended abruptly. I sat there a long while, phone in my hand, the screen dark. It took my mind some time to catch up to what had happened. My Hearing Assist app automatically records calls to sync audio, a feature I rarely remember. However, it has now become the most valuable aspect of the entire case. Henry listened to the recording the next morning. He put the phone down and looked at me without blinking. "Margaret," he said slowly and clearly, "this is golden evidence. Undeniable, unspinnable. It can't be explained away." I didn't answer. I just sat there, feeling something both terribly heavy and strangely relieving. Heavy, because I heard a family member speak of me as a burden. Light, because finally the truth had revealed itself. Henry placed his hand on the file, voice low and steady. "This case, Margaret. It's time to move into the decisive phase." I nodded. No more hesitation, no more confusion. Brandon's words, cruel but explicit, closed every last door of doubt and opened the way for the truth to be brought into the light. The courtroom at Maple County was smaller than I'd imagined. Wooden benches, the cool air from the AC, the faint smell of old paper. I sat next to Henry Dalton. Across from us, Brandon and Laura sat beside their attorney. Laura kept her head bowed from the moment she walked in, while Brandon maintained a stern expression, though his shoulders were so tight they barely hid something. The trial began, Judge Carver, a woman in her 60s with a deep voice and keen eyes, took the bench. "We will come to order. Plaintiffs, you may proceed." Henry stood, calm as ever. Rowan Lim was called first. He presented his findings succinctly and directly, without beating around the bush. The unauthorized access came from a device within a 3.5-kilometer radius, exactly in the area where Brandon Hale resides. The login times match when Mrs. Cole was not home. This is not coincidental. Their attorney tried to interject. Perhaps someone used the same Wi-Fi. Rowan looked him straight in the eye, voice steady. "This is a personal device, not public Wi-Fi. The data cannot be mistaken." Brandon gripped the armrest hard. Patricia Hahn, the bank's fraud investigator, was next. The alert email was changed. The number receiving authentication codes was switched. These actions required deep access and accurate personal information, not a random hacker. Her final sentence dropped the courtroom into a few seconds of silence. Dr. Elaine Kurt brought enlarged copies of the signatures. "This is a forged signature. The strokes are shaky, pressure inconsistent, and the date was added in a different ink. I conclude this is not Mrs. Cole's signature." Brandon's lawyer said, "Maybe she forgot how she signs." Elaine answered with a single sentence, "No, this is fabrication." Finally, the two neighbors, Mrs. Lane and Mr. Hopkins, testified. Mrs. Lane said, "I saw Brandon use a key to enter Mrs. Cole's house twice when she was away. I thought he had permission. Now I understand." No one needed to say more. Henry turned on his phone and connected it to the speaker. "Your Honor, permission to play the recorded call." Judge Carver nodded. The courtroom fell utterly silent. So silent I could hear the ceiling fan turn. Then Brandon's voice came through. "She's old. She wasn't even going to use that money." A small sob escaped from Laura. Brandon's bravado collapsed. Aggression vanished, replaced by fear or shame. It was hard to tell. No one in the room moved. Judge Carver made notes, her expression unchanged, but her eyes colder than before. Their lawyer tried to object, but Laura suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, I want to speak." Judge Carver looked at her for a few seconds and then nodded. "Proceed." Laura stepped to the witness stand, hands trembling but her voice steadier than I expected. "I knew, slowly, but I knew. And I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing my family." She looked straight at me. "My mother raised me with kindness, and I let my husband take advantage of her. I was wrong. I accept responsibility." Brandon turned to her. "You don't have to." Laura shook her head firmly. "You do, because Mom deserves respect." That line hit the entire room. Judge Carver read her ruling clearly and firmly. "Based on the evidence, I order. All assets related to the matter shall be frozen. Reimbursement to Mrs. Cole of at least 60% within 6 months, with the remainder to be paid over 2 years. The case file to be referred to criminal prosecution with recommendation for full charges." The gavel fell. I exhaled for the first time in weeks. Brandon slumped in his chair. Laura cried, but this time not in despair, rather a little relieved, as if she had finally seen a way to make amends. The trial ended, but my journey continued. A journey not to defeat someone, but to reclaim my life. News of Brandon being fired spread faster than I expected, not because the lawsuit was being talked about, but because the construction company he worked for valued its reputation. An employee involved in the financial exploitation of an older adult, plus a crystal clear recording. There was no reason for them to keep him. On the morning he received the news, Brandon got just a short phone call. "Your contract is terminated under the professional ethics clause." No arguing, no pushback. He simply packed his things and left the site. It wasn't some dramatic downfall. It was just the natural consequence of wrongdoing, something that was bound to happen sooner or later. As for Laura, After the trial, she moved out of their shared house, a small third-floor apartment, old but quiet, which was the most important thing for her now. "I need to start over, Mom," she said as she carried boxes, one by one. Laura found a full-time job at a pharmacy near downtown Maple Ridge. Not high-paying, but stable. Every evening, she went to therapy. She confessed to me one afternoon in the kitchen. "I always knew Brandon had issues, but I was too afraid to face it. Afraid of losing my family, afraid my daughter would grow up without a father. I chose silence because it hurt less, but it turns out silence only made everything heavier." Her voice carried no excuses, no blame, just truth, spoken after being held in for too long. I simply nodded. Sometimes facing the truth is its own form of courage. Their family was separated, not because I wanted it, but because of Brandon's own series of poor choices. Laura now lives alone with her daughter. She told me that during the first few nights, the little girl asked, "Where's Dad?" All she could do was hold her tight. But slowly, a new life formed. Laura handled everything on her own. Her daughter ran around the small apartment, looking happier than before. And most importantly, Laura was learning to stand on her own feet. There was one small but real challenge. Brandon's first reimbursement payment arrived, 2 days late. Not out of malice, just because his account was restricted and the paperwork was messy. But that tiny detail made the story feel less too perfect and much more like real life. Nothing runs smoothly, not even after a court ruling has been made. Brandon faded out of every piece of news. Laura took slow but steady steps forward. The family broke apart, but it didn't collapse completely. It was a rebuilding process. Piece by piece, with each person learning how to live more decently. And that was the real consequence. Not losing a job, not paying money, but having to face yourself with nowhere left to hide. The weeks following the trial passed slowly, but no longer with the heaviness they once held. I began to feel something clearly. I was still here, still had a life to live, and I didn't have to continue alone. During the very first week, Mr. Hopkins stopped by. "Margaret, my son works in IT. He's free tonight. He can reset all your account security for you." I sat beside the young man while he walked me through each step: two-factor authentication, login alerts, and restricted access levels. No complicated terms, no irritation, just patience. "If anyone tries to access your account again, your phone will alert you immediately." His voice was firm. The next day, a locksmith arrived to replace every lock, primary and secondary. He said, "Your old door's solid, but nowadays it helps to have an extra layer. You'll be fine." Then came the financial advisor Mrs. Lane recommended. He helped divide my remaining funds into 3 sections: living expenses, medical emergency reserves, and long-term savings. "No one can access everything at once anymore," he said as he finished. I nodded. It had been a long time since I felt this safe. On Wednesday evening, I began a pottery class at the community center. A small room, warm yellow lights, the steady whir of a pottery wheel. I shaped each lump of clay, my hands clumsy at first, a little shaky. But the more I worked, the calmer I felt. No one asked about the trial. No one pitied me. Everyone just focused on their own projects: cups, plates, bowls. After 3 sessions, I made a sky blue bowl. The rim slanted slightly, the base a little uneven. I stared at it for a long moment, then laughed to myself. Imperfect, but usable. And more importantly, made by my own hands. I placed it on my kitchen table. Every morning as I brewed tea, I glanced at it and felt a little lighter. Late one month, Laura called, "Mom, Anna and I want to plant some flowers with you. Are you free?" The door opened. Anna ran to me, hugging me like there had never been a single day of distance. We went to the garden together. I handed her a small bag of sunflower seeds. "You know," I told her, "sunflowers always turn their heads to the sky, no matter what the weather looks like." She said, "Just like Grandma." I didn't answer, just patted her head. Laura knelt beside me, gently patting the soil. "Mom, I still have a lot to fix, but thank you for giving me another chance." I spoke slowly, clearly. Everyone needs a chance. But from now on, I want us to speak plainly, hold clear responsibility. A family isn't a place where people take whatever they want, but it's also not a place to cut ties forever because one person failed. Laura nodded. No pushing back, no avoiding. To me, that was worth more than 1,000 apologies. That night, after they left, I stood looking at the newly planted sunflowers. The soil was still damp, the breeze gentle. I whispered to myself, I forgive, but I don't forget. Forgiveness isn't about erasing someone's mistakes. Forgiveness is allowing yourself to breathe easier, to step into tomorrow without carrying a stone on your chest. I still keep my boundaries, still protect my life, but I keep a small door open for those willing to make things right. Life didn't return to what it was, but it began to get better, little by little, person by person. 3 months later, on a Friday afternoon, I stood in front of room 4 at the Maple Ridge Community Center. The chairs were neatly arranged, filled mostly with older adults, kind faces I'd seen every week at exercise class or pottery sessions. That day, I wasn't sitting among them. I was standing at the front. "Hello, everyone," I began, my voice slow but steady. "My name is Margaret Cole, and I want to share something important. No one is too old to be deceived, but no one is too old to stand up and protect themselves." The entire room listened in silence. I told them about my journey, not to complain, but to point out the signs many older adults often overlook. Financial questions that seem harmless, repeated small requests, and the frightening silence we fall into when we're scared of upsetting family. I spoke about community, about the law, and about courage. But more importantly, I spoke about family. Respect in a family, I said, looking at each person, begins with not hurting one another, and forgiveness is a long road, but it leads us back to a better version of ourselves. When the talk ended, I felt as though I had stepped one more foot out of the shadows. That night, I returned home and set the slightly crooked blue ceramic bowl on the table beside the vase of sunflowers Anna had planted with me. 2 things that didn't seem related, yet somehow matched naturally, just like my new life, imperfect, but clear and moving forward. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat down, and took a smile. If someone finds strength in my story, then everything I went through was not in vain. If you'd like to hear more stories about courage, resilience, and families finding their way back to each other, follow the channel. Let's build a warmer community together.